June 1944, somewhere in the western Pacific. The morning sun cuts through a thin layer of haze as the sea rolls in slow, heavy breaths. On the deck of USS Yorktown CV-10, hundreds of men move with mechanical precision, yellow shirts guiding aircraft, brown shirts checking engines, red shirts arming bombs, blue shirts hauling chains. Every gesture is sharp. Every color means something. Every second has a purpose. A captured Japanese naval aviator silent, exhausted watches from a guarded corner near the island structure. Only days earlier, he had launched from a carrier where order relied on shouted commands and instinct. Now he sees something entirely different, a floating airfield, where motion is synchronized like a machine. He watches an F-6F Hellcat slam down, its hook catching the arresting wire with a metallic snap. In less than 20 seconds, the aircraft is unlatched, pushed aside, and another is already coming in. No chaos, no hesitation, just rhythm. He murmurs to the interpreter beside him, almost in disbelief. We never had anything like this. And to understand why this moment shocked him, we must return to the world that shaped both navies. In the years leading into the Pacific War, both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy understood one truth: whoever dominated the skies above the ocean would control the Pacific. Yet the path each nation took to build its carrier force could not have been more different. Their doctrines, their engineering priorities, and even the way they viewed pilots diverged so sharply that by 1944, the gap between them would become impossible to ignore. Japan entered the war with some of the finest naval aviators in the world. The elites of the IJN Air Service were trained through a brutal, years-long system that rejected all but a tiny fraction of applicants. Skill, instinct, and individual mastery were celebrated. Aces were treated like warriors of an older era. The carriers that launched them, ships like Akagi, Kaga, hear you, and Sraya, were built to serve these pilots, not the other way around. Their decks were spacious, but lightly armored. Their arresting systems were functional, but minimalist. Safety procedures were thin, and turnaround operations relied heavily on the personal expertise of deck crews and pilots. Across the ocean, the U.S. Navy followed a different path. American doctrine emphasized the system, not the individual. The objective was not to create a handful of exceptional pilots, but to maintain a force large enough and efficient enough to sustain long campaigns across vast distances. This philosophy shaped everything: training programs, aircraft production, carrier design, and most importantly, the evolution of flight deck operations. By late 1941 and into 1942, events accelerated the divergence. During the early clashes, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway, American carriers often struggled with slower sortie generation and less refined deck coordination. But the U.S. Navy adapted with extraordinary speed. Catastrophe became the engine of innovation. After losses at Pearl Harbor and Midway, engineers and officers began redesigning procedures and equipment to extract every possible second from launch and recovery cycles. New arresting gear was installed on Essex-class carriers. Deck markings were standardized for clarity. Color-coded uniforms, adopted from pre-war ideas, expanded into a full operational language, each color representing a specific role, so that, even in the chaos of battle, movement remained readable. Crash barriers were improved. Catapult systems received upgrades for reliability under heavy use. Meanwhile, Japan, stretched thin across countless islands, struggled to replace skilled pilots and modernize carriers at the necessary pace. Their doctrine had been designed for short, decisive engagement. The Pacific War was becoming anything but that. By 1943, American carriers increasingly resembled industrial production lines at sea, where precise coordination mattered more than individual heroics. A landing plane no longer ended the cycle, it triggered the next. Every man on deck had one job, and he executed it relentlessly. Efficiency was not just expected, it became a survival requirement. The captured pilots who later stepped onto American decks did so with years of experience behind them. They knew the rhythm of their own carriers. They understood the noise, the danger, the motion. But what they saw on U.S. decks, the speed, the order, the sheer absence of hesitation, was unlike anything taught in Japanese doctrine, and this difference, born in the earliest months of the war, only grew sharper as the Pacific campaign intensified. By 1943 and 1944, the U.S. Navy had transformed its carriers into the most advanced floating air bases ever seen. What began as incremental improvements during the early war years evolved into a complete redesign of naval aviation operations. The Essex-class carriers, fast, spacious, heavily protected, became the backbone of this modernization. Their flight decks were engineered for relentless efficiency, capable of absorbing punishment and still launching aircraft at a tempo no other navy could match. Central to this evolution was technology. American arresting gear, redesigned with improved hydraulic dampers, allowed faster recoveries with reduced risk of wire failure. Crash barriers were strengthened to prevent runway blocking collisions. Catapults, once considered secondary on pre-war carriers, became essential tools that guaranteed reliable launches even under full deck loads or in poor wind conditions. Elevators capable of lifting fully armed aircraft ensured that the hangar and flight deck worked in harmony rather than competing for space. Japan's carriers, by contrast, struggled under the weight of attrition. Their pre-war designs rarely received major structural modernization. Many relied on slower, manually intensive systems. Elevators could not always handle fully armed aircraft. Armored flight decks were upset, making them highly vulnerable to bomb hit. Without rapid-fire crash barriers or the latest arresting gear, their ability to recover and relaunch aircraft deteriorated as the war intensified. But beyond machinery, the greatest difference lay in procedures and coordination. By 1944, U.S. carriers operated under a refined doctrine known informally as the deck park system. Aircraft were positioned across the flight deck, fueled and armed in coordinated waves. This allowed American carriers to launch massive strikes in rapid succession, often sending over 100 aircraft into the air within minutes. Deck crews practiced these cycles repeatedly, perfecting the choreography that captured Japanese observers later described as machine-like. Japan depended on a more traditional method, parking most aircraft below deck for protection. This required complex elevator movements and extended preparation times. The result was simple, but devastating. Japanese carriers could not match the American pace. During major battles, the difference in sortie generation became a strategic disadvantage, limiting Japan's offensive and defensive capabilities. Captured Japanese records show consistent shock at American efficiency. Pilots, officers, and maintenance crews noted how quickly damaged U.S. aircraft were pushed aside, how instantly crashes were cleared, and how flight operations continued almost without pause. Some wrote that American systems felt industrial, built for sustained campaigns rather than single decisive battles. Others noted the precision of color-coded deck crews: purple for fuel, blue for handling, yellow for aircraft movement, calling it a language of the deck that Japan had never developed. The impact of this technological and procedural gap became clear as U.S. forces advanced across the Marianas, Philippines, and toward Okinawa. American carriers could launch pre-dawn strikes, recover by mid-morning, launch again at noon, and still conduct late-afternoon sweeps. Japan, limited by slower processes and shrinking resources, could not keep pace. By the time Japanese aviators finally saw U.S. decks up close, some as prisoners, others during post-war inspections, the shock was absolute. The systems they observed were not just improvements. They were the foundation of a new era in naval warfare, and these differences, built over years of pressure, set the stage for the contrasting experiences that define the heart of this story. For Japanese aviators, the first sight of an American carrier deck in action was not simply a technological shock. It was a cultural one. Their own training had forged them into elite warriors, taught to trust instinct, personal initiative, and the judgment of senior pilots. On Japanese decks, the atmosphere was intense but fluid. Roles often overlapped, and coordination relied heavily on experience rather than systemized structure. By contrast, the American deck felt almost alien. The color-coded uniforms, yellow directors, green catapult crews, red ordnance team, purple fuel handlers, created an immediate sense of order. Every movement seemed purposeful, synchronized, and fast, with dozens of men executing tasks without hesitation. A single Hellcat landing triggered a cascade of actions: hook release, wing folding, deck handlers rushing in, tractors pulling aircraft aside. There was no shouting, no confusion, just motion. Captured pilots later wrote that this discipline felt industrial, as if the entire deck operated under a single brain. What they saw was not the celebration of individual skill, but the triumph of coordinated teamwork. The American system valued process and repeatability, ensuring that even newly trained deck crews could function with veteran-level precision. From men raised in a military culture that praised the lone ace, the American approach represented a new reality, one where war was fought through efficiency, not only bravery. And this realization carried a deep psychological weight, reshaping the way many Japanese pilots understood the enemy they had once underestimated. The tactical implications of U.S. deck efficiency were enormous. American carriers were not merely platforms for launching aircraft. They were engines of sustained air power. Every second saved in launcher recovery cycles expanded operational reach, protected the fleet, and multiplied offensive potential. A typical American strike group could cycle through multiple waves in a single day. Pre-dawn launches targeted enemy bases. Mid-morning flights suppressed air defenses. Afternoon missions struck naval fleets or ground positions. In contrast, Japanese carriers, already suffering from shortages in fuel, spare parts, and train crew, struggled to generate even two efficient waves under combat pressure. The deck park system was central to this advantage. By keeping aircraft parked and ready on the flight deck, American carriers eliminated time-consuming hangar movement. Meanwhile, flexible catapult use allowed launches even when wind conditions were less than ideal. This gave U.S. carriers the ability to strike first, faster, and more often, during major operations. This efficiency saved lives. Faster recoveries meant damaged American planes were not forced to ditch. Rapid refueling allowed escort fighters to maintain air umbrellas. Continuous launch capability prevented Japanese forces from regrouping after initial strikes. To Japanese observers, it became unmistakable. American carriers could project air power far beyond what Japanese doctrine had prepared for. It was not simply superior numbers, it was operational tempo, precision, and relentless forward pressure. If Japanese pilots were shocked by American procedures, they were equally stunned by the underlying machinery that made those procedures. POSSIBLEUS carriers, integrated engineering solutions that pushed the boundaries of what naval aviation could achieve in the 1940s. Hydraulic arresting gear, refined through years of testing, provided consistent deceleration even during heavy landing sequences. This reliability reduced deck accidents and allowed rapid turnover between landing. Improved crash barriers prevented crippled aircraft from disrupting the entire landing cycle, a feature Japanese crews envied deeply, as mishaps on their own decks often halted operations for long stretches. Catapult systems marked another critical difference. American carriers embraced catapult launches as a core tool, especially when deck space was limited or when winds were poor. Japanese carriers, by contrast, largely avoided catapult, relying on long deck runs that required ideal conditions. As aircraft grew heavier late in the war, this gap became crippling. Elevator systems also contributed to American efficiency. U.S. elevators could lift fully armed aircraft from hangar to deck, minimizing preparation delays. Their faster cycles enabled seamless movement between levels, something Japanese carriers with slower, often smaller lifts, struggled to match. The technological ecosystem on American decks was not about showing off engineering prowess. It was about creating a sustained rhythm of operations. And once Japanese aviators witnessed this machinery at work, they understood that what they faced was more than superior tactics. It was an entire industrial base built around mastering the battlefield of the Pacific. Behind the precision of American carrier decks stood a leadership culture that valued adaptability, engineering, and large-scale coordination. Admirals like Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and William Halsey understood that victory in the Pacific would depend not on heroic individual pilots, but on sustained, unbroken waves of air power delivered across thousands of miles of ocean. This strategic mindset shaped every decision, from training programs to carrier layouts to deck procedures. American doctrine evolved constantly. After each battle, U.S. commanders demanded detailed after-action reports, landing accidents, turnaround times, launch delays, equipment failures. Nothing was ignored. If an arresting wire snapped, the design was reviewed. If recovery cycles slowed, procedures were rewritten. If pilot fatigue increased losses, rotations were adjusted. Leadership treated the carrier deck as a system, a living structure that required continuous refinement. Japanese leadership, though filled with capable officers, operated under different cultural pressures. Tradition held deep weight, and pre-war doctrines, built around highly trained elite pilots, were slow to adapt to industrial reality. Japanese carriers lacked the redundancy, safety features, and procedural flexibility that American commanders demanded. When losses mounted, the doctrine strained under the pressure, unable to regenerate its skilled core quickly enough. To Japanese pilots observing American carriers late in the war, the difference in doctrine was unmistakable. What they saw on U.S. decks was not merely good training. It was leadership that believed in systems over individuals, engineering over improvisation, and endurance over spectacle. It was a doctrine built for long wars, and it was winning. Japanese pilots left behind diaries, debrief notes, and post-war interviews that reveal a consistent theme: deep surprise, even admiration, for American carrier systems. Some of these insights emerged during the interrogation conducted by U.S. Naval Intelligence in 1944-45, while others surfaced in memoirs published years later. Pilots described American deck operations as unthinkably fast, strangely quiet, and more controlled than any land airfield. Many expressed shock at the ability of U.S. carriers to recover dozens of aircraft in rapid succession, without halting operations for accidents or mishaps. Several noted their disbelief that American aircraft could be refueled, rearmed, and relaunched within minutes, a tempo they had never seen on Japanese decks. Enemy analysts were equally surprised. Japanese intelligence officers studying captured film footage initially dismissed the speed of American operations as propaganda. Only later, when pilots returned from combat describing the same efficiency, did the truth become clear. Some Japanese officers recorded specific technical astonishments: the strength of American arresting gear, the rapid clearing of damaged aircraft, the use of deck tractors and mechanized handlers, the coordination of U.S. deck crews as if following a script. These testimonies reflect not merely technological admiration, but a dawning awareness that the IJN was facing a fundamentally different type of naval force, one powered by industry, standardization, and large-scale organization. For many pilots, this realization was sobering. They were warriors trained in precision flying, but they were fighting an opponent armed with an entire industrial ecosystem at its back. Asterisk efficiency on American decks came with a price, one that both navies understood intimately. Flight deck operations during World War II were among the most dangerous jobs in the world. Jet fuel had not yet arrived, but volatile aviation gasoline ignited easily. Bombs and torpedoes were moved by hand. Propellers spun only meters from crewmen guiding aircraft in tight spaces. Even the smallest mistake could be fatal. American efficiency reduced but did not eliminate these risks. Accident reports tell the story. Burning aircraft pushed overboard to protect the deck. Ordnance mishaps. Arresting wires snapping under stress. Crewmen injured while rushing to clear wreckage. Yet the structure of American procedures, standardized, drilled, perfected, saved countless lives by minimizing the chaos that often magnified danger. Japanese carriers faced even greater hazard. Their lighter flight decks, slower crash control system, and more improvisational procedures meant that small accidents often became catastrophic. A single crash-landed aircraft could halt operations for hours. Fires spread faster. Damage control was less effective. Many Japanese pilots who saw American decks later remarked on how safe they appeared, not because danger was absent, but because discipline reduced its reach. This human cost formed an emotional undercurrent in the testimonies of Japanese aviators. They understood that behind American efficiency were thousands of lives protected by systems designed to support them. In contrast, Japan's reliance on instinct and heroism placed heavy burdens on individuals, often with tragic results. Asterisk these contrasting realities, human as much as technical, set the stage for the moment when American efficiency would decisively reshape the war's balance. June 19, 1944, the morning that would later be known as the beginning of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Shortly after sunrise, Task Force 58 steamed west of the Mariana Island. On board the American carriers, the flight decks were alive with motion, Hellcats warming engines, Avengers armed with torpedoes, dive bombers lined in disciplined rows. Above them, radar screens glowed with the first signs of approaching enemy formations. Japan's final major carrier strike force, the Mobile Fleet. The Japanese plan depended on coordination. Multiple long-range waves launched from carriers, hundreds of miles away. But even before the first Zero rose off a Japanese deck, the cracks in their system were visible. Delays on Zuikaku, mechanical issues on Juneau, slow aircraft handling across the fleet. The launch cycles stretched longer than expected. Every minute lost widened the gap between intention and impact. On the American side, the contrast could not have been sharper. As soon as radar detected the incoming waves, U.S. carriers shifted seamlessly into combat rhythm. Hellcats launched in tight sequences, each one guided to its takeoff position by yellow-shirted directors. Within minutes, hundreds of fighters filled the sky. Recovery cycles were equally fast. Returning aircraft caught arresting wires, folded wings, and were pulled aside with practice speed. Damaged planes were pushed overboard to keep the deck clear, a harsh choice, but one essential to survival. What happened next would enter history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters, guided by radar direction and superior communication, intercepted the incoming Japanese waves long before they reached the fleet. Outnumbered in the air but supported by perfect deck coordination, they tore through the Japanese formations. Many Japanese pilots, undertrained due to wartime shortages, struggled against veteran U.S. aces flying better aircraft. Yet, the core of the battle's outcome rested, not in the dogfights alone, but in what was happening on the decks below. Each time a U.S. fighter returned low on fuel or damaged, the deck crews worked at breakneck pace. Landing signal officers brought them down one by one. Arresting wires caught, barriers rose and fell, and tractors whisked aircraft out of the landing path. Within 20 to 30 seconds, the deck was ready for another plane. This relentless efficiency allowed American fighters to rearm and relaunch, while the Japanese were still struggling to get second-wave pilots into the air. Japanese survivors later admitted that during the battle, their own decks were overwhelmed. With fewer skilled deck crews, slower elevator cycles, and minimal safety barriers, accidents multiplied. A single crash landing could block operations for 20 minutes, an eternity in carrier warfare. Some aircraft had to be pushed overboard manually. Others waited on the hangar deck for fuel or arming delays. The entire Japanese launch system collapsed under battlefield pressure. By midday, the sky told the story. Burning Japanese aircraft fell into the sea across 1,000 miles of ocean. Hundreds were lost in just hours. The American fleet, protected by a continuous shield of returning and relaunching fighters, remained largely untouched. Even the few Japanese planes that broke through found themselves facing relentless anti-aircraft fire and perfectly coordinated interception. The day ended with staggering numbers. Japan had lost most of its trained carrier aviators, many of its irreplaceable aircraft, and the operational tempo needed to wage carrier war The U.S. Navy had lost far fewer, and still had the deck capacity to launch another massive strike at sunset. In that single day, American deck systems didn't just support the battle, they shaped its outcome. As the sun set on June 19, 1944, the scale of Japanese losses was becoming clear, but the full impact of American deck superiority would reveal itself the following day, when Task Force 58 launched a massive counterstrike, one of the largest in carrier history, while Japanese carriers struggled to recover, refuel, and relaunch what little remained of their air groups. American decks operated with near-continuous precision, preparing more than 200 aircraft for a late-day offensive across open ocean. The command decision was bold. The Japanese fleet lay at extreme range, pushing the limits of what American aircraft could reach and still return. Yet Admiral Mark Mitcher trusted his deck crews. He trusted the tempo that had been built through months of relentless refinement. At 4:10 p.m., he gave the order, "Launch everything we have." On the decks of Essex-class carriers, engines roared to life. Yellow-shirted directors ran across the windswept steel, guiding Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers into position. Catapults slammed aircraft forward in rapid sequence. Within minutes, the strike group was airborne, a wave so large that pilots described the sky as crowded with wings. Across the sea, Japanese carriers were facing a very different reality. Their decks were scarred from earlier accidents. Their crews were exhausted. Fuel shortages hampered launch readiness. Worse still, the majority of their surviving aircraft sat on hangar floors, not flight decks, requiring time and elevator cycles the fleet no longer had. Few planes got airborne. Even fewer returned. The power of Japanese naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, had collapsed under the weight of attrition and inefficiency. When the American strike group found the Japanese fleet near sunset, the result was devastating. Hiyu was hit and fatally crippled. Zukaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, suffered multiple near misses and damage that further slowed her dwindling operations. Other carriers, already struggling, burned or limped away. Many Japanese pilots who launched that evening never found their ships again. They ditched into the sea at night, hoping for rescue that never came. Yet even after inflicting this destruction, the Americans faced their most dangerous moment, returning in darkness, low on fuel, across more than 200 miles. Night carrier landings were notoriously difficult, and for many pilots, this would be their first attempt. Mitcher made a controversial, but humane decision. He ordered all carriers to turn on their lights, an enormous risk with enemy submarines possibly nearby. Floodlights illuminated the decks. Signal lamps cut lines through the dark. Cruisers and destroyers lit their running lights to create guiding lanes on the ocean. It was a moment where discipline, training, and the human element blended into a single act of solidarity. Pilots circled in, one after another, trusting the deck crews below to catch them safely. American efficiency did not falter. Arresting wires gripped aircraft one by one. Barriers caught those that missed. Damaged planes were pushed aside in seconds. Even in darkness, the deck teams kept the cycle moving. Dozens of aircraft landed safely because the system held together. Because discipline outpaced chaos. Japanese aviators, interviewed after the war, spoke of this night with astonishment. One former pilot said simply, "Our carriers could never have done this. Not in darkness. Not with so many aircraft. Not with such order." The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with a truth impossible to ignore. Japan had lost not only aircraft and pilots, it had lost the ability to fight a carrier war at all. And American carrier deck systems, perfected through necessity, became the decisive advantage that shifted the Pacific forever. In the days following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the scale of what had happened began to settle across both navies. Reports flowed into American flagships detailing aircraft losses, pilot recoveries, and damage assessments. The numbers were staggering. Japan had lost more than 300 carrier aircraft and, more critically, the majority of its remaining veteran aviators. Entire squadrons had disappeared. Some carriers limped back to Okinawa or the Japanese mainland, with barely a dozen functional planes aboard. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, these losses represented far more than a tactical setback. They marked the collapse of an aviation tradition built over decades. Before the war, Japan had invested immense effort into crafting elite pilots through long, grueling training programs. But by 1944, the system was fractured beyond repair. The rapid mobilization required to replenish air groups had produced undertrained replacement. Many never mastered the complex skills needed for carrier operations. When they confronted American air power, supported by disciplined deck systems, the imbalance became inescapable. On the American side, the aftermath looked very different. U.S. carriers, though fatigued from intense operations, remained structurally sound and operationally ready. Their decks were scratched, their crews exhausted, but the system held. The Essex-class carriers demonstrated their resilience. They could take hits, sustain operations, and support large-scale strikes repeatedly. Replacement aircraft flowed in from forward bases. New pilots arrived weekly. The machine kept moving. This momentum allowed the U.S. Navy to intensify operations across the Central Pacific. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam soon fell under American control, giving the U.S. airfields close enough for B-29 bombers to target Japan directly. The loss of the Marianas was a strategic catastrophe for Tokyo. It severed Japan's defensive perimeter and exposed the home islands to long-range bombardment. Inside Japan, the shock of the battle reverberated through naval headquarters. Senior officers understood the grim implications. Without the ability to project air power from carriers, the Japanese fleet was effectively blind in the vast Pacific. Battleships and cruisers, once symbols of national pride, could not survive without air cover. Even the most powerful vessels were now liabilities rather than assets. Meanwhile, American crews continued refining deck operations. Lessons learned during the Philippine Sea, particularly the night recoveries, were analyzed and turned into new procedures. Carrier aviation was evolving in real time, becoming more capable, more efficient, and more lethal with each operation. The tempo only grew stronger as U.S. forces pressed toward the Philippines. Captured Japanese pilots and officers who were interrogated after the battle spoke with a mix of disbelief and defeat. Many described the American system as impossible to match. Others admitted that Japan's carrier strategy had been fatally outdated from the start. Their testimonies aligned with what American analysts already understood. The war had entered a new phase, one defined not by individual pilots, but by industrial power and refined naval systems. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea was not merely the loss of aircraft and ships. It was the irreversible shift of naval dominance. Japan could no longer fight the kind of war it had started in 1941, and as the U.S. Navy prepared for the next stage, the push toward light and the liberation of the Philippines, the consequences of this imbalance would only deepen. The months that followed the Battle of the Philippine Sea forced Japan to confront a stark and irreversible truth. Its carrier force, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was no longer capable of meaningful offensive action. The loss of experienced pilots, the destruction of irreplaceable aircraft, and the collapse of coordinated deck operations had created a void that no amount of bravery or last-minute improvisation could fill. American intelligence confirmed what many Japanese officers already feared. Photographs taken during reconnaissance flights over Kure and other naval bases showed carriers anchored quietly, their decks mostly empty. Fuel shortages made regular training impossible. Spare parts were scarce. The remaining air crews were often untested, rushed through accelerated programs that could not replicate pre-war standards. Even if Japan had managed to preserve more of its carriers, it lacked the operational infrastructure to use them effectively. In contrast, the United States moved into a period of exponential naval growth. New Essex-class carriers rolled out of shipyards at a pace unmatched in world history. Fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers filled the Pacific with an overwhelming presence. More importantly, each one carried the increasingly sophisticated American deck system, refined through combat, standardized across fleets, and constantly improved by engineers and officers who reviewed every mishap and every success. This modernization paid off during the next major campaign, the liberation of the Philippines. During the Battle of Light Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle ever fought, American carrier groups demonstrated the full power of their deck operations. They launched and recovered hundreds of aircraft in the span of hours, striking Japanese battleships, cruisers, and remaining carrier forces. Japanese deck operations, now crippled, could not match even a fraction of this tempo. Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor carrier, fought bravely but was ultimately overwhelmed and sunk. Her final air group was composed mostly of inexperienced pilots who had little chance against American fighter screens. As the war pushed toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the technological gap widened further. American carriers absorbed kamikaze hits yet continued operations due to armored flight decks, rapid damage control, and resilient arresting systems. Japanese reports from this period reveal astonishment that U.S. carriers could take severe damage and still launch aircraft within hours. Their own carriers, built with lighter materials and slower deck systems, rarely survived such impacts, and when they did, flight operations were often crippled. Post-war analysis from Japanese officers was remarkably candid. Many acknowledged that Japan's failure to modernize its carriers and deck systems had been fatal. They noted that American doctrine emphasized survivability, repair speed, high-volume operation, principles Japan had underestimated. Some senior naval engineers wrote that even if Japan had preserved more carriers, without adopting American-style deck efficiency, they would have remained tactically inferior. American officers, studying captured documents, reached similar conclusions. They recognized that U.S. carriers had not won solely because of better aircraft or superior radar, but because their decks functioned as highly coordinated ecosystems. Every resting wire, every crash barrier, every color-coded crewman, and every elevator cycle contributed to a battle rhythm Japan could not challenge. Thus, the aftermath of the Philippine Sea and the subsequent campaigns revealed the core truth behind the Japanese pilot's astonished remark: "We never had anything like this." it was not arrogant, nor exaggeration. It was the sober reflection of men who had witnessed a revolution in naval warfare, a revolution driven by systems, engineering, and discipline rather than mythic heroism. These realizations laid the foundation for the world's understanding of modern carrier power, and they shaped the navies of every nation that sought to rebuild after 1945. The closing months of the Pacific War left behind more than wrecked fleets and shattered air groups. They left a lesson, one that Japanese pilots, American commanders, and post-war historians all came to understand with clarity. Carrier warfare was no longer defined by the daring of individual aviators or the prestige of great ships. It was defined by systems, the unseen architecture of discipline, engineering, coordination, and relentless refinement. When Japanese pilots murmured, "We never had anything like this," they were not merely commenting on technology. They were acknowledging an entire philosophy of war. American carriers did not operate through instinct or heroism alone, operated as floating ecosystems where every man, every wire, every procedure had a role. Efficiency was not a luxury, it was a weapon, and it proved as decisive as any bomb dropped or torpedo launched. This shift marked a turning point in human history. It showed that modern warfare would be shaped not by the few but by the many, by engineers designing safer arresting gear, by deck crews mastering seconds, by leaders who valued adaptation over tradition. The Pacific War made clear that the ability to learn, analyze, and evolve was as essential as courage. For Japan, the realization came with a heavy cost. Their pilots had fought bravely, often against overwhelming odds, but bravery could not substitute for the systems they lacked. For the United States, victory revealed the power of integrating human discipline with industrial strength, a model that would define naval aviation for decades. Today, every modern carrier in the world, regardless of flag, echoes the lessons learned on American decks in 1944. Color-coded crews, standardized launch cycle, armored flight decks, rapid recovery procedure, night landing protocols, all are descendants of the system that once left enemy pilots in awe. And so, the words linger not as a boast, but as a reminder of how mastery is built, not through myth, but through countless small improvements forged under immense pressure. We never had anything like this, a simple sentence, a profound shift in the history of naval warfare.